Poppy Playtime Chapter 4 has a ton of things hidden behind the scenes and out of bounds. As the longest chapter yet, there's quite a bit to see. And in this video, I'll be breaking down each area of the game meticulously to show you everything you weren't supposed to see. From secret cut areas, to some interesting game-breaking occurrences, and a closer look at some neat slow motion stuff. So I hope you enjoy, and let's jump right in. So for each area, I'll be doing a short recap of what transpires there, so we can then go back and show how it works. We start the game off on an elevator with Poppy heading down. After stepping off, we navigate through a tutorial area where we need to grab a battery. We open the door and then run, jump, swing, and squeeze through some caves. We then burn some rope and make our way out to the toy graveyard. As we walk through these hills, several minor jump scares occur, like critters scurrying about, or arms moving in the piles. We then see the prison entrance. But before we can make it to the Batcave, Abraham Lincoln pops out of his grave. And by honest Abe, I mean we get swarmed by an army of little dudes. A way then opens up on top of this hill, and we make our way through to a loading station. We then move some boxes to witness this furry thing on the toilet, which then lets us solve an electricity puzzle to board this strange trolley train. Let's turn back time now. So going back to the elevator ride. As the map loads, we can see that Poppy starts off in a T-pose before starting their animation. And while this is going on, we can check out this whole elevator shaft to see what's up there. There's lots of doors and platforms, and there's objects on these platforms, but none of the doors actually lead anywhere. And this goes up for quite a while, with balconies that the player would never even see. So if we were to break off this elevator and make it onto one of these platforms, we can see that these walkways actually can be walked on. They all have collision, although there's nothing that we can do up here. So it's kind of funny, but if we were to fall to the bottom and hit our checkpoint, we can then reload our checkpoint and have the elevator come down to us, and we can get on as it's opening up. This then lets us take the elevator up with Poppy, and as she's talking, she normally gets cut off. But as you can see, nothing actually cuts her off, and the dialogue still gets cut off. She will then eventually stop her animation and start T-posing as the elevator continues to go up, and then it will all come to a halt. At this point, we're kind of stuck here because of the big invisible walls around the elevator, so yay, we're soft locked. Now, the tutorial area isn't really too exciting. There's kind of nothing here, but there is this sort of tunnel that curves off to the right, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So if we exit this area, we'll eventually make our way to some caves. And in this room off to the left, we can actually look out to see a cave system before us. Now, the way this is pulled off is there isn't actually a cave system there. There's a few rocks in front of us, but there's actually 3 layers of flat images that make up this sort of perspective that we see. So there's a big image in the back, and then we have these like 2 archways that we can kind of look through. And when these are combined, it looks like there's a distant cave. This saves the game and the player having to render out this entire cave system if they're looking out, so it's actually very optimized to do it this way. But this is the camera just flying around so you can see what this looks like from different perspectives. The next area we come to has flowing water and a waterfall, and this is what that looks like up close. Now we can't get out of bounds here because there is a impressive invisible wall, but we can still take a look at this. Similar to the waterfall off-axis area, there is also some holes in the ceiling up ahead that let us see a bit of a building, but if we look up above, there's actually no building there, but we can't see sort of like a walkway. So at this point, I'm just going to zoom out so you can see this whole area, and it's honestly quite impressive how it's all layered together. Now this is just the first area, and the toy graveyard will load in next, but not until we go through that little squeeze section. This section basically acts as a loading switch for the next area. Now, this graveyard is full of lots of low-poly models. It's a very impressive, visual section as you're meandering through this, and there's things occurring around you. You have these giant piles of bodies on both sides, and you have critters that scurry across, and there's also these arms that move in the piles. All of this helps contribute to the tense situation that the player is experiencing. You don't know what's going to jump out, and it's actually a very good build-up for horror. But let's break down the flow of this graveyard bit by bit. So the first thing we come across is this critter that scurries across. And as you can see, it exits just clipping through the pile of trash, and then it ends up just running through the bodies on the other side. Once this animation is complete, the toy then T-poses beneath the pile of bodies. And next up, as we move forward, we're going to see an arm that's waving to us from the trash pile. And I find these very interesting because these are all pink, and they're all actually Kissy Missy. So there are multiple big Kissy Missies in this area, and all of them are just sort of like contorted underneath the pile of trash, and only the arm is sticking out. Well, that's not true. The feet on this one is still sticking out from the T-pose, which is kind of funny, but the arm will flail around and then kind of fall limp onto the pile of trash. And this happens several times, each with a Kissy Missy underneath a different hill of bodies. And these Kissy Missies are not damaged like the variant we see later in the chapter. Now, as we come around this bend, there is a truck that we can see a critter goes on top of. And the critter is actually clipping through the paint cans, which is kind of funny, but this critter will eventually disappear, or you could shoot it with your flare gun to get rid of it early. Now, I want to stop here and talk about these paint cans for a moment, because they kind of do break the immersion a bit. They say prop house on it. Now, you wouldn't normally see these, you'd walk by them, but if you actually look, that is the tag of the creators of the assets. So this is a stock asset, and this is part of their trash asset pack. Now, you'll notice a lot of the asset packs made by Prop House are also found in Poppy Playtime. Just look at the sewers. Do any of these things look familiar? Perhaps you'll find some of these things as you're wandering through the chapters of Poppy Playtime. So moving on from the truck, we now have the prison in front of us. And as we walk up to it, the prison door, of course, shuts. But what would happen if we got inside? Well, first let's take a look. If we go beyond the prison door, we'll see this room full of chairs that have bars and closed off sections all around. Beyond that is a very plain room that has some furniture, and it curves off to the left that goes basically nowhere. It leads out of bounds. Now, if the character was back here, you would see that they are basically stuck behind this giant door in this enclosed area, and there's nothing we can do. There's nothing really fancy about this, except we're safe from the animals outside now, so that's a plus. So when you approach this area, a bunch of toys come to life up above, and they run down the hill and attack you. Now, eventually they will retreat, and if we follow them with the camera, you can see that they sort of just climb up this hill, and then go off to the right and vanish, and they sort of climb on top of each other sometimes, which is pretty funny to watch. However, we are not done with these toys yet, because there's something that can happen with the player's physics. So if the player controller, the character we play as, if it gets overloaded by directional forces, it kind of messes up all the physics. And so we have too many inputs, we can actually shoot off into the sky like a rocket. And if this happens, we can land on top of the pipe here. We can walk around on the pipe, but we can't really go anywhere because the ceiling collider is a bit low. But yeah, there's lots of super jumps in this game, so I'm curious how speedrunners are going to utilize them. But anyways, let's move on. So there is a metal section that ends up opening up on top of this hill, and you can see it moving right here, that allows us to pass after this event takes place. So now we make it into some more caves, and there's nothing interesting right here, except the fact that there's a tunnel to our left we cannot access. We can see a small sliver of this, but if we check out this tunnel, we'll find a floating cylinder that has a default material applied to it. The player cannot normally see this, but I'm not sure why it's here. So now we are in the loading zone for the trolley. So a couple quick things here. All the containers here have the plush interior, even the ones we can't open. Also up above, there is this dead thing in this toilet that gives us a key card. And it's strange because it has a skull and rib cage. It looks like a destroyed Huggy Wuggy or Kissy Missy type monster. The teeth are also different than what you would see with Kissy Missy or Huggy Wuggy, as the bottom jaw is the only one that has teeth. The eyeballs of this creature have a reflection of the room assigned to them that you normally cannot really see. And speaking of dead things, we also have these dead guys. These mummified workers are used a lot in this chapter, and we'll see more of these fellas, but here's a close-up. There's also an overlooked floating light here that has nothing attached to it, so that's a thing. You'll also find out that this is a no fun zone, because if you try to take the boxes with you inside the trolley, they will vanish the second you step inside. So unfortunately, we can't have a very cramped experience while riding this trolley to the next area. And in case you are curious, the trolley doesn't move. No, once we step inside, only our camera shakes around and the trolley stays put. Which makes sense, because why would you animate that? No one would see it. But we can see that once this sequence is done, the map will unload, and we get warped across the map to the next area as it loads in. And if we skip moving across the map, as it unloads, we'll fall straight down into the endless void. But now it's time for a prison break. Literally. This whole section just reminded me of the movie Cabin in the Woods. If you know, you know. So in this section, you'll need to leave your cell and activate a switch from above. This will unlock the front of your cell, allowing you to head downward. You'll have to look for a hole in a different holding cell to drop down as you make way to the bottom level and through a boarded up tunnel. This eventually leads you to an area where you'll get a red hand, as you get jumped for your lunch money. You survive the scuffle, punch in 3255 into the computer at the end of the area, and then open the faraway door. With your new red hand, you'll hang up an Ollie, who won't stop calling, and then scoot your way down a hallway of bodies for another Ban keycard. You open a door, drop down to a red gas zone, and have to hurry and find a valve to turn it off, thus allowing you to leave the prison cell blocks. Let's go back to our cell for now and end the recap. So starting off, let's talk about what's beneath this entire prison area. So if we go beneath the floor, you'll find that we have all these different nightmare critters lined up on each side, and they're all in a T-pose. And I can only assume that these are here so that when the ambush happens, they'll have all the models already fully loaded in. So we can fly through them so you can see them in all their T-pose and glory. But down here is something else as well. There are 2 pieces of developer text left behind beneath the level accompanying these objects. One has a battery slot with the phrase, "Use to turn off hand scanner above," and another is an electrical source that says, "Do not delete," needed to keep an HS in unpowered state. And we can only assume that the HS stands for hand scanner given the other developer text. So both of these are down here with the nightmare critters on both sides. When we first unlock our cell and leave it, we're going to see a nightmare critter scurry on by. And if we follow this critter, we'll see that they go into the cell next to us, and they loop around to the back and essentially disappear where the toilet is at. Next, we can encounter 2 critters eating meat in a cell, and this cell serves as a tutorial for us, showing us that we can shut the doors to prevent the critters from escaping, which will come in handy in a little bit. So there's a couple things about this cell. One, if you shut the cell door and stand there, you're going to get smashed between the cell door and the invisible wall, preventing you from going inside. This does kill you, and there is no checkpoint, so you're going to have to unlock your cell again. Now, I wanted to see what happens when we actually shut this door because these 2 critters stop eating these meat pieces that have bones in them, which is interesting. But they stop eating, they turn around, and it looks like they're about to jump at us, but they don't. So they actually just freeze in place. The one's mouth is sort of clipping through this metal thing, and they stand there. If we were to go inside the cell while it's shut, we can see that we cannot interact with them in any way, shape, or form. Our hand simply does nothing, and we can just slap them around. So on the bottom level, there are 2 critters that are eating a catnap. This dog day is going to town. But underneath this catnap, beneath the floor, is another version of this catnap that is twitching and bleeding. The one up above that's being eaten does not move though. So I'm not sure exactly why this was swapped out, but you can disintegrate the body up above with your flare gun, so maybe that has something to do with it? I have no idea, but it's there. So when you get the red hand, you of course get ambushed, and you normally have this ambush in this little area here, but we're going to stay in the safety of the room we came out of. And what this does is it causes all of these nightmare critters to pile up on the door, and they start jumping on top of each other. And it's kind of funny because they actually just form this giant wall. Some of them get pushed on top of the door, and it's just this tsunami of stuffed animals. So we can actually just wait this out. However, I wanted to then move my character outside with maximum enemies, and I just let these critters destroy me. So they're constantly hitting me and pushing me back, and it's the mouse one that actually gets the jump scare, as you can see, as it latches onto where my face would be. On this next life, I actually moved behind the cells, where you normally go through that little boarded up tunnel, except the boards were still up. So all the critters piled up against the boards and were trying to get me, but they could not. A mini Huggy showed up this time, and over here, by this pile of bodies, you can see these 3 critters that are kind of stuck and just sort of being a bit glitchy. So when this ambush is over, all these critters just sort of like walk away, like nothing happened. And we can see them walking through the boards right here, and actually walking under my character before they unload. Now in this prison area, there is a lemon collectible that is fun to squeeze, and it says lemon in a super cool accent. Now this is something from previous chapters, but you can find it right above here in this prison cell. And there's also another one that can be found out of bounds, like way out of bounds. So it's an easy Easter egg to overlook. So after we leave this area and we get to that hallway of mummified workers, we can see they all relatively look the same, but a lot of the suits have different names. So I'm gonna go around right now and show you different names on the suits. But funnily enough, there are some repeat bodies that are right next to each other with the same name. Perhaps someone forgot to swap it out? Or this guy just had a lot of brothers, or is cloned. Moving on, when we get to the gas challenge in the other prison cell block, we go through this really convenient crawl space. And when you go through it, you can actually watch this happen, but a rock will kind of come out of the back and just fall straight down. And it definitely looks a little hokey, but it does prevent you from going backwards, which is what they intended. But that's what it looks like from a different perspective. Not long after this, we'll be exiting the prison cell area, so let's continue with the recap. You end up punching another code in, which overloads the system and blows out the window in the office you're in. You go through some hallways with jump pads that lead to some vents, and then ultimately stumble into a room with a 2-switch puzzle. Plop some boxes under the doors, and you can clear the puzzle. You step onto a pressure pad, which I assume is designed for big creatures, and a door opens up, allowing you to trap yourself in a room where Yarnaby is revealed, as the monster attacks the window. The doctor makes another appearance as well, of course. We now enter an area where Yarnaby is aggressive. We can see Yarnaby turning a corner as Doey unlocks a gate for us. As we move on into the next room, we must light some boxes on fire to distract the beast while we advance. Doey helps with this too. As we leave, the beast tries to attack us in the vents. This leads us into a room with 2 hallways where Yarnaby will pursue us. We must avoid being seen as we escape into some vents. This ultimately leads us to the first Yarnaby chase, where we outrun the Madden Ball of Yarn into another vent. With that said, let's rewind back to the hallway with the jump pads. If we take the camera out here, you can see that this place truly looks much different from the outside looking in. Now if we move back inside, we can take a closer look at the lab papers on the floors in some of the rooms and see that they are just copy and pasted paragraphs. Beyond the 2-switch door, the weighted scale we stand on has support beams under it that you can never see. But now let's talk about Yarnaby and when he first appears. So in the area where Yarnaby appears, behind the glass, we can see all the other nearby cells are empty, including the one where it looks like Yarnaby's claws cut through the metal door. So for Yarnaby's cell, he first appears in the cell until you step inside, and then he gets warped underground. As the cutscene plays out, Yarnaby will be warped back into the cell just before they jump out. And this is what that jump out looks like in slow motion. They just sort of appear in the cell, normally obscured by darkness, and lunge out at the glass. Watching this in slow motion is definitely freaky. So Yarnaby will then retreat into the side tunnel as he clips through the wall, and then he'll sit back here and eventually unload. Now, if we redo this scene, Yarnaby will be placed actually in a different spot before the cycle repeats. So we can find them underground like this, and if we break out of bounds, we can see them, but our hands can't do anything to them. There's also a Doey stored way down here too. In fact, there are several Yarnabys and Doeys stored out of bounds in this area. It's interesting because Doey's default model has him with red sharp teeth, but when he talks to us, we don't see any teeth most of the time. So as we move into the next room, Yarnaby will spawn in, just exiting our sight and climbing into the metal door area. And from another angle, this is what that looks like as we wander in. So the monster straight falls to the floor like a fool. And watching this again, we can see how they vanish underground. Now up above, Doey's hand comes down to unlock the gate. And above the ceiling, we can find Doey in a sideways T-pose, with his one arm just stretching down through the ceiling and unlocking the gate. So next up we have the fire room. And I love this room a lot because a lot of funny stuff happened in here. So first off, I want to see what happened if we got in front of Yarnaby without activating him, and then set the boxes on fire, and then climbed up into the vents. And nothing happens. He stays in his little hole. As you can see, he's peeking out right there. So if we do not light the fire over here, Doey is actually going to do it for us and throw a flare onto it. But Yarnaby in this room does not activate until we go into that crawl space. So there's a little crawl space right before Yarnaby pops out, and that is the trigger for making him jump out. And so we do that, and he jumps out, all majestic-like, and he wanders over to the fire. Now when we grab this handle, Yarnaby is going to start attacking the vent. So this animation is set to repeat indefinitely, but the trigger for disabling Yarnaby in this room is actually a little too big. So if you wander over to this vent, this trigger should be placed at the bottom of the vent, but it stretches high enough so that when you touch it at the top of the vent, Yarnaby will freeze in place. So we can go back into that room, and now Yarnaby is just basically frozen in time, and now will not interact with us. So the jump scare trigger is removed, so we can actually just jump into Yarnaby, and nothing's gonna happen. We can pass through them, we can touch them with our hand. They are a non-threat. So Yarnaby will stay like this until we go back into that same crawl space. So the second we crawl into that crawl space, Yarnaby comes back to life and becomes aggressive once again. However, they don't know we're down here, so we're safe, I guess. And so the reason they deactivate Yarnaby is because he's making a lot of noise and the player's never going to see them again, but it's also because we're going to see Yarnaby again in the vent. So Yarnaby will walk by in this red section that's far away from the vents, but you can see it through the fan. And this is just a little diorama they mocked up to have a vent section you cannot reach. And so Yarnaby will walk past this, continue to walk in place, but they will then vanish and then warp to the front of the vent and stand there frozen in place. Now this next room is kind of glitchy. And I love it, but I also realize there's a lot of problems with this room. So when we start moving through this room, Yarnaby is going to jump out like the majestic yarn cat that they are, and we can watch that in slow motion right here. But as soon as the player passes him and sneaks on by, he's going to instantly warp to clawing at this fence. And this is weird because you can kind of see him snap into place in normal gameplay if you have your angle just right. But what's strange to me is how glitchy this part is. So Yarnaby is supposed to be destroying this fence, and he'll stay like this until you get near the end of this room. If you go backwards, you can shoot your flare gun at him, and he won't even react, which is kind of odd because fire is his weakness. But like I said, once you reach the end, things get weird. So Yarnaby will straight up duplicate himself as he falls to the fence. He then shoots off like a rocket out of the room. It doesn't make any sense at all, and it feels kind of incomplete. Like, I can sense inspiration taken from Monty's Door Jam and FNAF Ruin, but the end of it all is just so confusing to the player because it normally happens so fast. And both Yarnabys basically shoot through the wall, and they're in the room that the fire was happening in, and they're both just clipping through the storage shelves before both copies unload. And the fence is still standing too. Yarnaby phased through it without destroying it. So yeah, maybe that red gas is hitting me harder than I thought. So next up we have that chase. And for some reason, Yarnaby's head gets shrunken as he appears. So up top, Yarnaby's gonna jump out as we turn around. And I think they shrunk his head to prevent it from clipping through the metal covering, or maybe to create the illusion that he was stalking you like a lion. But it's just a bit odd because the rest of his body is clipping through the metal grating above, so it kind of ruins the immersion a bit. However, I will say I love the animations on Yarnaby as he's popping up like a playful kitty, but we can watch his tiny head Yarnaby eventually grows into big boy Yarnaby before the chase starts. And after this chase finishes, when we reach the end, Yarnaby will just sit outside the door as the door gets hit repeatedly. He shrieks, and then he backpedals insanely fast, shooting down this hallway like a rocket before they unload. And after this, we have some vents to go through, and we've come into Doey's domain and the safe haven. And with that, that's everything I found hidden behind the scenes in the toy graveyard and prison areas. So after narrowly escaping Yarnaby through the vents, you'll head through this storage area to a viewing glass overlooking a small courtyard. Here you'll come face to face with Pianosaurus. Before we can become his next meal, a set of hands lifts him from the floor and slam him around, dragging him into the darkness where he's eaten himself in an ironic twist of fate. We now meet Doey, who leads the way to the safe haven by walking through a wall and peeking around corners to guide us. After squeezing through some iron bars, he then shapeshifts into a bridge and a giant platform in order to help us traverse this cave. You arrive at a prison yard where 4 chains need to be attached to the door in order to open it, and so you'll search the area for levers before you can pry the door open and continue onward. We'll leave the recap there for now and jump back in time. So with the lights now on, we can have a look at this containment area where Pianosaurus is currently eating. One of the very first things you'll notice is that despite all the chomping and crunching sounds you'll hear from up above, this musical reptile is not eating anything whatsoever. Despite his strange new diet, we can still have a much better look at this enemy. He has scaly green armor with colorful spikes from the top of his head to the end of his tail. The entirety of his underside is a piano though, and the same goes for his teeth. I find it funny that this character is capable of eating anything at all, since there's no clear indication where his mouth opens in the first place. Maybe he was just running up to us so we could play a song on him. Now taking a look out of bounds, there are a handful of interesting things hidden beyond the walls of this map. To start, the big locked door leads to one of these colorful isolated cells. So it is fully modeled inside, as you might have expected, but I don't believe we ever gain access to it. Outside the map, we can see that this prison chamber extends beyond the outside of the level as well. If we take a look further out into the void, we'll come across a few sets of arms floating in a diagonal line. They're all currently frozen in different poses, and the one on the bottom is doing what looks like an OK symbol while the others are winding and twisting around. These set of objects will remain here until we jump down to Pianosaurus' paddock, where they'll be moved to a separate location. Something else I found while exploring out here is a small purple object that was swinging around wildly beneath the map. I wasn't sure what this was at first, since it appeared and disappeared, depending on which direction the camera was facing, but when looking up close, I realized that it was one of Pianosaurus' horns. I'm not certain as to why this piece is down here, but when the game is unpaused, it flails around like crazy as his eating animation loops. Now as you enter this area, you'll typically climb through the broken glass up top and walk across the ledge, taking an unfortunate fall into the containment area where Pianosaurus becomes aware of our presence. Watching this cutscene though, I wondered what would happen if you managed to drop down without triggering this sequence. Well, by shrinking the player down to the size of an ant, point, I was able to do just that. Because we're so unbelievably tiny, we can now slip through the open window without coming in contact with the ledge's trigger. Since we don't have to scale the wall, we avoid activating the falling sequence, and we can now walk around freely. Because we're down here early, Pianosaurus does not approach us. As a matter of fact, he doesn't care we're down here in the slightest. He continues to slam his face against the floor, pretending we don't even exist. On one hand, I'm glad, but on the other, that's just rude, man. Pianosaurus does have collision here, and because of this, we can climb on top of his back and take a ride in this reptilian rodeo while he's eating. Doing so results in the player being thrown around as he thrashes his head, and this whole thing feels like a discount Jurassic Park action scene, which is way funnier than it should be. Beyond that, we can head over to the open balcony and use our grab pack to escape unhindered. But our actions have done more than progress the story. We've also managed to save Pianosaurus from Doey altogether. Despite this, Doey still spawns in as usual, just with a fully intact musical dinosaur behind us. Unfortunately for him, this is HorrorScoped, so we won't be letting him off the hook that easily. We'll be triggering the sequence as intended now for a better look at how it works. As soon as we hit the trigger up above, Pianosaurus perks up and turns around to face us. While this is taking place, the hands we saw out of bounds earlier will be moved inside the wall behind him. As he lunges forward, the arms will quickly stretch to the length of the room, glitching out a bit as Pianosaurus is pinned to the ground. Hilariously, the hand giving the OK sign is still out of bounds, letting us know that everything is under control. The hands lift our dino friend up and begin throwing him back and forth, strawberry jelly splattering on the walls as he hits. It's really funny because you can see one of the hands glitching out as this takes place too. As he's slammed to the ground for the last time, he gets dragged out of sight. But here you'll see his head detach as his body is ripped through the wall. The only objects remaining in the level being his head, hand, and one of his horns. His body remains out here, completely entangled in Doey's arms, as dinosaur pieces fly out at the player. At this point, Doey will now be loaded in outside the wall next to Pianosaurus, and with the game unpaused, we can watch as he slides through the wall into the room with us. He's frozen in one pose until he gets far enough into the room, where his animations begin and he struts forward to greet the player. There is not much to see during this initial greeting, but what I wanted to know is what happens when he slinks out of view. As you can see, his neck stretches a bunch as his body leaves the scene, walking into the crack in the wall as his head flings forward and Doey unloads completely. Overall, this is what the cutscene looks like from our typical view, but with the lighting enabled, and it's definitely a lot less terrifying this way. Now, as we press on, we'll see Doey appearing at the end of this hallway where he pokes his head out. If we watch this from another angle as the player triggers this, we can see that a copy of Doey is moved into the map around the corner. He pokes his head out, catches his hat, and then ducks out of view again before he unloads. A few doors down from here, we'll find Doey poking his head out through a door yet again, but this time things are a bit strange looking off camera. Inside the room, his body is doing some pretty crazy yoga moves. His right arm is sticking straight out, while the other is clipping through the floor, and his legs are stretched behind him at a weird angle, while his entire body is floating above the ground. When we get near him, his head will quickly retract, and Doey will unload the same as before. After triggering this specific sequence, we'll see that one version of Doey remains in the same room. This version of our Pillsbury pal is T-posing in front of some iron bars, waiting for us to enter the room. But there's something odd here that'd be hard to miss. Both versions of the metal bars are loaded in here at the same time, and the broken ones will vanish as we enter the room, and Doey starts his exit animation. As he passes through the bars, a strange blue slime will surround Doey as he presses through like Play-Doh, turning around when he realizes his hat is stuck. When he pulls the hat through, the bars will be instantly replaced with the broken ones we saw earlier, allowing the player to bend them open and pass through them. Immediately after this, Doey continues onward and jumps into the spike-filled pit below, clipping through the rocks and stalagmites as his body stretches into this super tall shape. He almost looks like an in-between frame from an old-school cartoon now, and I never would have guessed this is what happens after he jumps down. We can't get through this giant cave without Doey's help, and so he transforms into two different objects in this area to help us get by. Something you'll quickly learn is that Doey took credit from some other Play-Doh monstrosity, since a preloaded bridge is moved into the map after he jumps down, and it just slides out through the rocks and into view. Honestly, I feel a bit cheated. The next bridge is this giant circular platform with arms and legs that's bolstering some crazy rock climbing skills. This platform, which kind of looks like a dinner table made out of clay, gives us the ability to cross this chasm. But once again, this isn't the same Doey who just ate a dinosaur for us. As a matter of fact, we can zoom out and see both of these bridges are loaded in at the same exact time. Who knows? Maybe it's possible that Doey split into multiple versions of himself in order to maximize efficiency when crossing spiky pits. That, or it's just a game development trick, and we're totally overanalyzing it. After passing through this open cave area, you'll eventually duck through this small hole in the wall to enter the prison workyard. As soon as we enter, Doey does this straight Looney Tunes wind-up and bolts straight through the wall. During this animation, his head first flies through the wall, and his body becomes consumed by this blue slime once more. As he's initially passing through this break in the concrete, this gooey material stops in the outside wall and he's completely clean in the center, but the liquid reappears on the other side and covers him again. This strange substance splashes outwards and then gravitates back towards him afterwards. Even though he abandoned us in this eerie room, it's almost like he never left. Literally. The area Doey started this short sequence in still has collisions enabled, so we can't walk through the spots he was previously standing, even though the animation has already finished. We can even climb onto these barrels and jump on top of it if we want to. If we move the camera through the set of doors, we'll eventually be wrenching open. We can see Doey yet again holding this cartoony pose. Even though he'll run away the moment we pass through the doors, he has idle animations that make him look a lot more lively than a static model. I realized at this point also that Doey blinks every so often, despite his lack of eyes, which for some reason makes him seem more human, despite being a giant chunk of bubblegum. While we're exploring this area in search of the levers needed to continue, Doey lends a helping hand and throws one of them through the window up above. He also throws out a Dog Day plush that has been nothing short of mutilated. And if we head out of bounds before this is triggered, we can find said toy T-posing in the void. As soon as we put in the first lever and approach the yellow tower, a new lever will appear hidden away in these barrels. After a moment, Dog Day is warped inside as well, and they both fly out through the window. With the doors now opened up, we can head through. And as we do, Doey will instantly bolt out of sight, which he obviously enjoys doing a lot. We can once again watch this from a different angle, and as we've come to expect, he'll slink off with his neck stretching wildly before unloading out of our sight. As for the hallway itself, we can view this section from an aerial view, where we learn that the architect forgot to put the second floor in. There is nothing for us to see up here, only caved-in walls and frayed rebar. Something weird about this area though, is that there's a set of stairs on both ends of this hallway, and each of them leads to a door on top that we'll never be able to see, let alone access. When we meet up with Doey a bit further ahead, he'll be sitting next to this hole in the ground where we drop down to the floor below and we're met with a cogwheel puzzle. We're given a battery by Doey, and after opening the doors, we enter what looks like a kitchen. Once again, a lever is needed to open the doorway, and Tui, which is the name of this mouse thing actually, attacks us from the storage room where we find it. In this hallway, we're stopped by Kissy and Poppy, who are hiding from the prototype in the walls. From here, we enter Safe Haven, a giant room full of toys who are saved by Doey and the gang. Doey reunites with us here, leaving to distract the prototype shortly after. After talking to Poppy, we'll meet up with the Pillsbury boy for a lengthy conversation regarding Poppy's plan to stop the prototype. At Doey's request, we must now head deeper into Playtime Co. in search of the doctor, leaving Safe Haven behind. Jumping back in time again, we'll arrive at this area where Doey is standing next to a hole in the floor, and in this room is a locked door that we never end up accessing. If we move the camera into this room, we'll find a pretty surprising sight waiting for us. Doey the Dough Man, posing while clipped halfway into the wall. This specific version of Doey has his sharp red teeth visible, and he's here for a pretty important purpose. When we drop down to put the cogs into the machine, his arm will stretch down into the hole to deliver us the goods. And after we take the battery from his hand, his arm retracts back up through the hole, giving him the worst muscle cramp I've ever seen in the process. We can't typically see this taking place during gameplay, since there's a black barrier in place here that obstructs our view. Now, there isn't anything to see in this room here, but as we move into the kitchen, we'll catch a glimpse of Tui running across the wall and vanishing out of sight. Following him with the camera, we can watch as he runs sideways on the wall and climbs behind the blockade in front of the door. That's not the last we'll see of Gusteau's favorite vermin though, and when we head into the storage area to grab the lever, we can see that he spawns in behind this body bag hanging from the ceiling. If he stands still, he just leaps endlessly inside this room, but the moment we step inside, he begins chasing after you until he runs out of sight and unloads. At this point in the game, we're supposed to move this barricade using the chain so we can get through, but there's a gap underneath that we could clearly fit through if we crawled. Sadly, that's not an option in this game, so I had to break out Mermaid Man's belt again and shrink the player down to whatever the opposite of Wumbo is. By doing this, I was able to slip underneath and enter the next part of the map early. But what else could I get away with? Because I was so microscopic, I was able to get past this barricade in the hallway and pass through the hallway Kissy leads us to. But there's a little problem with our sequence break here. Because we never activated the prototype cutscene, there's an invisible barrier blocking our entrance to Safe Haven. But I wasn't giving up that easy, and so I went around the back in hopes of finding a way in. But the game had other plans for me. I managed to phase through the door at the end of this hallway and fell into the void. And because the game doesn't expect you to ever fall off the map here, I endlessly dropped into outer space. Loading my save, it was time to trigger the Kissy Missy cutscene as intended. But before doing so, I moved the camera into the corridor without activating them. As you can see, Kissy is hunched over near the opening with one of her arms clipping through the wall as she waits for the player to walk by. And Poppy has apparently decided gravity is for dweebs. It's kind of funny because the developers didn't bother to put Kissy back far enough, So you can actually see this in normal gameplay by just walking up to the gap in the hallway and looking in to see her clipping through stuff. We can now watch this hiding scene taking place from a different view, and as soon as the player triggers the sequence, Kissy will reach out and drag you into the corridor with her. At this point, the prototype makes an appearance in the hallway, and from out here you'll see that, before even moving by, the shadow on the wall is already loaded in. There's no actual monster out here casting this shadow, and instead it's only a black silhouette on the wall. As a matter of fact, this shadow is nothing more than a short video we can find in the game files, and this is done so that data miners and game breakers can't view this character before they want you to see it. So for now, this enemy only exists as a shadow on the wall. After the prototype passes by, Kissy and Poppy walk to the other side of this inner wall, and Kissy clips through the wall as she leaves to enter safe haven. After we've entered, the doors will be closed behind us, and Doey, who was previously waiting on the other side of the room, will run over to greet us. After a brief conversation, Doey runs out of sight to distract the prototype, and when doing so, he runs past the batteries only to freeze in place and unload near the exit. But with that being said, we can now have a look around safe haven. This area is packed full of tons of toys, and the walls are lined with drawings that I'm sure have tons of lore for all you theory crafters out there. Starting with the main area, the first thing I found that was a bit strange is this vent on the wall. For some reason, you can open this grate in the wall that's covering a fan, and although we can interact with it, it currently doesn't have any real use in the game. But there's more to this vent than you'd first think. If we move the camera through it, we'll pass by a black barrier into a strange back room, where several vents in this area intersect. This area was meant to be traversed by the player at one point in time. Some of these segments simply lead nowhere, and they come to an end either by stopping abruptly or by reaching a broken grate out of sight. One of the places they lead, though, is this room that's completely tucked away in safe haven, a room labeled storage. I was never able to access this room while playing through the story, and we can't even get near to see inside due to the invisible barrier at the entrance. I kinda wish it didn't have an invisible wall in an open doorway because it's peak laziness and confuses the player by making them think it's a bug. It would have been way better and more clear to the player to just block it off with trash or something. Anyways, this looks like a small recreation room where the inhabitants of Safe Haven can hang out. There are tons of books lining the shelves and tables for the toys to sit at. And there are a couple of characters hanging out in here as well. The books all have unique covers that feature slightly obscure names of the developers too, so that's a neat find. There's a boogie bot next to the bookshelves, a mini Kissy Missy laying on her stomach reading a book, and even a picky piggy in the corner. If we move the player inside, we can explore the room in person. And I'm not exactly sure why this room went mostly unused in the game's final build. I imagine it's tied to the cut side quests that once took place in Safe Haven, as can be found referenced in the game files. On the other side of Safe Haven, we can find another lounging room in the infirmary, and this area only has a small section of walkable ground with the rest being blocked off. Slipping through this barrier, we can have a walk around the stage area where we'll find a dog day sitting behind some pallets, something I missed during my original playthrough. On top of the stage, there's a sleeping mommy longlegs, two smiling critters, and a mini Kissy Missy, who really seems to enjoy watching TV. I don't know why, but there's something about this little plush watching a blank television screen that's hilarious to me. But hey, don't let me stop you from doing your thing, Kissy. Speaking of our pink friend here, in the main area, we'll eventually drop down through a vent tucked away in this blanket fort. But on top of this open grate is a mini Kissy Missy. In this pose, it looks like she ran as fast as she could into the vent and opened it with her face. But we can't typically see this character while walking around this place. She also turns completely invisible depending on the angle we're looking from, and so I didn't even realize she was laying here at first. Speaking of hidden characters, in this area we can find a mommy longlegs stuffed into this locker that you can't normally see. I wonder who the bully is in Safe Haven who did this to her. Something else I realized while messing around here is that you can have a look outside the map without the use of hacks. So basically, if you walk into a vent while crouching and stand up at exactly the right time, there's a chance that you'll clip through the top of the vent and be able to walk around freely without the typical restricted movement. By doing this, I was able to see across the void and into the generator room from outside the map. Not only this, but up above we can see a part of the level we won't be exploring for a little while. And since we're already viewing this from out of bounds, this is what Safe Haven looks like from an out of bounds perspective. And with that, that's everything I found out of bounds and behind the scenes in Doey's Safe Haven. So we've just got done talking to Doey, as our new objective is find and defeat the Doctor. Leaving Safe Haven, we'll make our way through this wormhole-like tunnel and into the sewers. We'll then pass a grid on the wall, where we can hear Doey and Poppy talking about what's best for everyone, as they both appear to have different thoughts on that. That can't be good. After figuring out the way to go, we'll want to take this elevator up to progress. This will lead us into a room with a vat of a green substance, where we can find a collectible and a videotape here. This follows with a big open cave-like area, as we get a static-filled call from Ollie. There are a couple of carts on the tracks here that we need to move in order to activate them. This in turn will allow us to thread our powered up arm through the energy poles, hence unlocking the door allowing us to progress. Pushing on, we'll come to a drop-off here, as we use the chain hanging from above to safely swing across. Approaching these two doors, we can see that one needs power, as the other one appears to be the answer to said power. So once we slap our hands on these panels and activate it, mistakes were made apparently, as we've granted Yarnaby access to our flesh. Don't look back like I did my first time around though, because it could be a fatal mistake. However, getting through this door follows with us sliding down to temporary safety. Let's go back and take another look at all of this though. Starting off, I went ahead and brightened up the view and immediately zoomed out to take a broad look at everything. We can see Safe Haven is still loaded in, but what caught my eye was the tunnel that connects it to the sewers. There is a giant gap between the ends of the tunnel. This is because when we're normally going through it, it acts as a loading point, with the player unknowingly teleporting to the other half of the tunnel. This would explain why our hands disappear in this section, as warping with a grab pack activated would probably cause problems. While flying around, we can see how they use a projected image on a curved surface that is tethered to the camera's rotation, creating the visual we typically get when we walk through the tunnel. I will say it's odd that the image for when the player goes back up the tunnel also had the out-of-bounds portions baked into it, as in you can see the building sections you shouldn't be able to. Anyways, if we fly away while we listen to Doey and Poppy talk, it has the same results as if we walked away as a player. The dialogue will just fade and cease to continue. Not to mention, we can see that Doey is still trying to figure out these gauges up above. But after checking out my hands, as I cycle through them, I managed to find my way through and into one of these block tunnels. However, it was met with immediate failure, as I unsurprisingly fell through the map. Coming over here, in this area, you won't fall forever, as you can see a death barrier here contained within these red lines. There is a giant image out here of a big open cave, which is used for when we look through this particular area in the sewer, consisting of 2 layers. Similar to what we've seen at the start of the game. It was definitely glitching out for me while I was observing it. Even during my first playthrough without hacks, it still seemed to be having issues, as it will load in and out sporadically while trying to observe it. There isn't much else going on in this next area though. However, coming over here, we can squeeze under these boards and venture back further. It'll lead to a dead end where we can observe a bunch of small rocks floating in the void, along with an elevator shaft, which if we go down into, leads nowhere, as we're now stuck. Quite the view the player would get if they manage to get over here though. Moving on, I managed to skip this puzzle by just getting far enough under the door before falling into the great beyond, which activated the autosave. This then loads us back up on the other side of the door. Reaching this point will now unload Safe Haven, as we can see Doey at this pipe now waiting for our arrival. I found it funny though, because on the other side of the door here, that we initially can't open as we progress, is where Doey is at. Is he purposely ignoring us? Seems kinda sus. Swinging over from this chain above, we can see Yarnaby loaded in as he waits for us to open the door. We can get another good look inside his mouth, revealing that he must have one heck of a dental plan. When he engages us, he'll give a treacherous scream, as he then pursues us, presenting both sets of his terrifying teeth. We can see while in slow motion, during the death animation with Yarnaby, he'll paw at us as he turns the player's hands around. He'll give us a moment of hope as he happily stares at us, only to quickly reveal that we're his next meal. However, if we go small boy mode when releasing this beast, we can run over here and hide just out of bounds, as we're able to squeeze in out here given our size. This results with Yarnaby not having the slightest idea where we are, as he'll patrol the area until we come out. So once I was done hiding, I gave Yarnaby the small snack that I am, and reset the instance. Something I realized here was that if we increase our size, this will allow us to use the chain we had swung across from before. This highly upsets Yarnaby, as he'll see us over here and pursue us. He'll just stop at the cliff though, unable to do anything about the predicament. I did notice, however, that Yarnaby began glitching out when he spawned in during another instance, as I slipped into this door and hung out on the edge here. He appears to be having a seizure, as another Yarnaby appears, being the one that we normally see first, as it swipes through the opening of the door. I'm not sure how I did it, but I broke him during another instance while he spawned in. The other half of his face was not where it's supposed to be, making for an even more horrific scene. However, once he makes his way out of the doors, we'll see that he'll readjust, snapping his face back into place. Once we make our escape through this other door, Yarnaby will teleport right to it, as he abruptly disengages and speeds off before disappearing. I actually noticed this during my first playthrough, which was interesting. But let's continue on as we normally would. Don't want to keep Doey waiting. We're hit with a new objective now, as we need to find a way out of no man's land. We need to power on this contraption, which in turn allows us to access this room, where a key card that we need is located. Grabbing this will cause Yarnaby to show up, which can turn fatal rather quickly. However, if we do this entire sequence fast, you'll be able to evade Yarnaby with no issues. We're now on a conveyor belt that leads us into the next section, as we need to swing across to safety so we don't get ground up. This part is going to involve similar electrical puzzles like the one we had just done. Yarnaby will be lurking around during this. Well, maybe. That is if you ended up not being one of the many that encountered a glitch that made this whole puzzle Yarnaby-less. Lots of people who played this on launch had no threat in this entire section, which was very strange. Anyways, you'll need to find multiple hand scanners that we need to use in order to proceed. We'll do this in this particular section, then have to come back out from where we came and find a door that requires a lever. Once acquiring the lever, we can open this door and we'll power up another station within, along with grabbing this keycard. This follows with having to figure out how to power up the required stations that in the end grant us passage to the next area. The door will shut behind us once achieving this, but as soon as we open this next door, Yarnaby will be right behind us, as we now need to run for our life. A chase begins that eventually leads to a jump, as we swing across this chain from above. I was definitely panicking during my first run with this, and frantically tried to open the next door. However, Yarnaby bites off more than he can chew here, as he gets hung up on the chain we just swung across, and begins to burn, ultimately falling to his death. With that though, let's go back once again, and see what takes place outside of normal gameplay. So after sliding down and escaping Yarnaby, I took the camera for a spin to check out the next area we're about to go into. But there wasn't much to see. Grabbing this keycard next to this poor little soul, we can see Yarnaby move very quickly on screen, as we see him crawl out. I'm not sure what happened here, but I was expecting him to come over like he normally does and continue patrolling the area. There was no sign of him though, so I went ahead and checked and could see he was just standing there, as he scared me back into this cubby. It turned out that he was stuck though, and could not pursue me, even while teasing him with my hands and flares. Thinking it was an isolated incident, I restarted the instance and grabbed the keycard again. But nope, he wasn't budging. He clearly wanted blood, as I kept popping him with flares, but I was safe, so I simply carried on. Making our way down this motionless conveyor belt, you'll be able to see the few boulders in front of us that end up getting broken up into this large machine. However, I made my way back to that Yarnaby, who ended up breaking out of his slumber-like state as he was patrolling that area once again. His head was placed on the body in a strange manner again, with the mouth opened up in a locked state. He'll linger here until we get to the next starting point of the following puzzle, which is once we pull this lever, as the electric slides once coming out of the vent-like compartment. He'll use these areas to get around this map more quickly, as they are scared about this puzzle. While retreating into one, we can see how he'll squeeze in and sit there for a brief moment before teleporting to another one, where he'll come out as we saw before. I noticed that these hiding spots that we can use aren't 100% guaranteed safety, as he'll just know where you are and eventually kill you, despite not making a sound, etc. I'm pretty sure that's unintended, and it's a bit frustrating. Aside from that though, not much else takes place here, so let's bypass the exit. Once completing the puzzle, we'll open this door, which ends up triggering the chase scene we have with Yarnaby. So instead of running as we normally would, I decided to turn small and hide, so we can see how he reacts. Turns out though that the chase scene Yarnaby is just a copy, as the other one, that we've been evading from before, continues his patrols. This Yarnaby will begin chasing though, despite the fact that we're not there. He'll go all the way up until the jump, which ends up being his fatal mistake. However, he'll just stop and stand there in a creepy, motionless state. Meanwhile, I'm back here with the other Yarnaby, as I think fast and run my tiny butt away from him. This one isn't able to get too far, with it being unable to pass this point. What I thought was odd with all of this is that if we play this part out normally, you can actually see that there are two Yarnabys behind you as this chase begins. I have no idea why the developers didn't anticipate this would happen by deactivating the roaming version, seeing as Yarnaby chasing you into this area could be a common occurrence, so he'd still be outside? Proceeding forward, we can sneak up on this Yarnaby, who I initially thought was broken and harmless, but the joke was on me, as I get jump scared. Moving on, watching Yarnaby in slow motion during this death scene is a trip. He'll flail all about in a wild manner, making for an intense scene. Of course, we're not going to see the full visual effects here, given the mode we're currently spectating in, but it's all the same, aside from seeing him engulfed in flames, as you can see here. This death is also weird. I don't think I really understood what was happening the first time. Anyways, you can see the hook struggling to keep up as I was observing this, but that's probably because of the game's speed being messed with throughout this sequence. I'll have to say though, my favorite part is watching him fall further down as his arm stretches for days. He is hanging on for dear life and refusing to let go. He'll proceed to fall all the way through the map as he comes to a stop quite a ways down below. He looks like a giant ember floating down here. His model material will change back to normal shortly after though. He'll just rest in peace down here indefinitely, as he is no longer a problem anymore. Let's push on as we normally would though, shall we? Yarnaby is toast, and now we're going to make our way into this capsule-like elevator as it will take us into a new area. Pushing on has us meet up with Doey. He'll go on about how he was gathering parts for the generator, but then is cut off as the pipe next to him bursts. This ends up tragically freezing him, but there is a lever right above us, which allows us to shut off the pipe. Doey will then thaw out and limp away in a disgruntled manner, cleverly foreshadowing his weakness. Walking out the door, our objective will update as we're tasked with making our way to the doctor. Realizing we're back in this area that we were in before, we'll swing across and head this way where Yarnaby had come out from before. The doctor will start talking to us once we reach this point, as we need to move these blocks over so we can hop on them to progress. We then encounter quite a few of these cooling pipes that are leaking. The cold gas coming from these pipes will slowly but surely hurt the player, so we need to find the levers and shut them off accordingly. This will allow us to access the canopy that has the key card inside, which will allow us to progress. Using the card will then open this door. This will bring us to a cold storage operating room of some sort, where we'll end up getting our blue hand stuck on a scanner, as the doctor activates a pipe to freeze our hand in place. The room will begin to get colder and colder as time passes, prompting the player to find a solution quickly. In Cold Storage Unit 2, we'll find a battery that we can then place in this saw up here. I initially thought I was supposed to cut my arm off that was stuck, but that wasn't the case. After nearly dying, I realized we need to pull the saw over, which will cut this cord, allowing us to pick up this blue hand that was attached to it. You'll then use this new hand to solve the room. With the doctor out of the way for now, we can progress through here where we'll see a spotlight. Let's go back though and take a look at things from a different perspective. So we just torched Yarnaby, but I forgot to mention before that, if we go into big boy mode here, we can swing back and, well, get stuck out of bounds actually. However, after readjusting my size, we'll fall back down safely. This allows me to backtrack, which leads us to finding the Yarnaby that was once roaming this area, who is now frozen in place. I'd like to pretend that this is Yarnaby's spirit resting in peace, as he appears to be calm with that cute smile. But that's wishful thinking, of course. I was able to play dentist with him though, and I got my hands all up in his mouth-throat thingy, making for an awkward time. I moved on at this point as I got into this capsule that takes us to the next area. We can see that it actually just teleports us. This tracks because when we normally do this part, you'll notice the screen fades to black briefly, as we hear the capsule shooting off, creating the illusion that we used it. I messed up though while tinkering with the game. This resulted with us being in the capsule, which had already teleported, leaving me stuck in here until I reloaded again. Wait, why do I hear boss music? I don't know why, but when reloading at this point, the chase music began playing once again. Take a listen. Unsurprised at this point, we can see that Yarnaby is back frozen in place. Continuing on though, the chase music never stopped playing, even when reaching Doey, as I figured it would have stopped. I can't imagine going through this scene normally, barely being able to hear the dialogue. I do have to say though, watching Doey get frozen in slow motion is extra sad. You can see how the model's material will eventually change in set intervals on Doey, perhaps with a mask, giving the frozen appearance that we normally see. Whereas when he thaws, we can see at the same speed that it's a more smooth transition. Overall looking pretty, chill. There was something else I noticed though. Doey will freeze again once the door shuts behind us. I don't know exactly why this takes place, but it did lead me to finding his teeth, which can be found stored inside his head, as you can see. They too have the frozen appearance, like the rest of his model. That must be one heck of a brain freeze, but let's carry on. As I progressed with a new objective, I couldn't take it anymore and tried restarting the checkpoint in an attempt to get rid of the chase music. Thinking this would resolve the issue, confusion set in even further, as not only did the music not stop, but the objective changed to run. So instead of running, this prompted me to go behind the scenes and seek out any potential reason for this to be happening. I did end up coming across the Yarnaby from the section before, who was just wandering about. However, when I went back to where he got eliminated, I discovered a Yarnapede scenario taking place. Didn't expect to find this, but here you go. It appears I'm stuck with the chase music forever. Anyways, it was here that I noticed an opening in the wall where I believed I could see out of bounds. Going in closer confirms it, as I was in fact seeing another section of the level through this wall. I went back to the normal view to see if it made a difference, but I definitely could still see out there. Moving on though, the part where we need to turn off the cold gas pipes seems a bit silly. I realized that I could just slowly push through the Arctic blast and safely get in here to get the keycard. The amount of freezing it does to the player is very minimal, which follows with the player being able to do the same thing as we exit this area. So you don't need to deactivate anything at all. Mr. Freeze would be proud. Coming into the next area, where our hand ends up getting frozen to a scanner, doesn't have much going on outside of normal gameplay either. However, as many others have, I did notice the blue hand's glitchy arm that's just floating up here. It's safe to speculate that this should have been connected to the body that's in a bag up here, the one that has a mask on and a grab pack. I think this ultimately confused about every player, as they assumed this blue hand was a glitched version of their own, because its origin was nothing. Moving on would lead us to the maze area, where we have to navigate through the red gas and whatnot, but we can slip under this door and use the sky lift prematurely. We get the full ride, just like if we're taking it when we're supposed to. This does reveal portions of the map unloaded along the way, which is unsurprising of course. We'll reach the end of the ride though, and get a checkpoint, basically bypassing the whole next section, including the doctor fight, but failing to get the Omni Hand. Whoops. And with that, that's everything I found hidden in the sewers, wastewater plant, and no man's land. So next up, upon entering the surgical area, Sleeping Beauty here is wearing a gas mask that will need to enter the red gas maze outside. Within this super confusing labyrinth, we'll search for 5 different toys, each of them missing a different body part, which reveals the solution to the puzzle. Once we've hacker-manned the code into the computer, a door opens upstairs that gives you access to the doctor. Well, another part of him at least. Moving on from this room, Doey attacks and pulls the gas mask off your face. And as you navigate the jump puzzle ahead, your right hand is disabled by electricity due to one of the doctor's traps. This forces you to swing across this gap in the following room, being blasted with electricity yet again, as you're dropped into a maze full of caged nightmare critters. Baba Chops is now released into the maze, and you have to evade her persistent attacks while gathering batteries and rerouting power in order to escape. You'll then have to make a difficult decision, killing the trapped Simon Smoke to open the door, or accepting your fate. For now, the recap will stop there, so let's jump back in time to the red gas maze. First off, let's have a look around this first maze area from another perspective. The location we're exploring during this part of the game is a huge cave, surrounded by scaffolding and stone pillars. Typically, while playing through this section of the game, your view is badly obstructed by the gas mask, and I suppose the thick layer of red fog doesn't help that fact either. Within the maze are a bunch of these smaller segments, and these areas are locations in which the toys we're looking for can be found. When viewed from an aerial perspective, it's kinda neat, because these walled off areas create mini hallways in the open space between them. Somehow this almost makes it harder to navigate the winding halls here, since they form inaccessible corridors we can't access or see from inside. Placed inside this map are a bunch of elevators, or what I believe are pneumatic tubes, and following them up through the ceiling reveals that they don't lead anywhere at all. Whatever went inside these things just rocketed into the vacuum of space. The same goes for these rock pillars. They're separate from the walls of the mine itself, and extend outside the map's boundaries. While checking out these objects, I saw this weird object poking through the ceiling. Following it through the roof and into the building reveals there was actually an overhead light used in one of these surgical rooms. These are currently emitting light inside the level, and it's not only one object either. It turns out this lighting fixture was extended by using a second copy of this object and putting them end to end, which is why this other end sticks through the roof like this. We can even disable one of them here, which shows how this is pulled off a lot better. Now inside the starting area, there are a bunch of screens depicting various characters that we must find in the maze, and I wanted to know whether these were live feeds of the toys or just images. I quickly ran through the maze to locate Bunzo and stood behind him, and I even shot one of my hands out for good measure. But unfortunately, when viewing the camera, there was no sign of the player. Even when I shot to flare the back of his head, still no dice. I did, however, learn that this area isn't put together all too soundly. By walking into the side of this raised pedestal, we can walk straight through it. There is no collision on this specific piece of the map, and apparently Bunzo realized this before we did, since he's phased halfway through the wall as well. The grates these characters are sitting on don't lead anywhere either, and there's merely a black barrier underneath it that gives the appearance that it leads somewhere. Now, in order to survive the trek through this area, canisters from these dispensers are needed to refresh your gas mask frequently. When you press the button, a canister pops out, but when viewing this in slow motion, you'll see that it just appears out of nowhere and falls onto the floor. Not that it matters, since this machine isn't connected to anything anyway, so teleporting them into existence was the only option regardless. There's more to these refills than you'd first think though, since they're actually the greatest weapon the prototype has ever used against us. If you put your hand on one with a grab pack and then leave the room, there's a chance your hand will just break off instantly. The hand is just gone, and believe it or not, it gets even worse. If we grab the refill with a right hand instead, we completely lose the ability to swap between them if it breaks, meaning we lose access to any of our hands until a previous save is loaded. After making your way upstairs, you can then go up to give Doc a shocking reminder of his mortality. Taking a look inside, we can see his liver floating inside the container container with multiple needles poking into it. There's also a constant flow of red gas circulating inside as well, but what happens when we give him a good zap? When the plug is inserted, sparks begin jumping through his organ as flames begin to erupt around it. I also realized that this model can be viewed from inside as well, which is pretty disgusting. The entire thing is covered in this pure black texture, indicating its demise, and we can now continue our journey to put an end to the Doctor. Now when we exit through the following doorway, we'll be jump scared by the mischievous Doey. From another angle, we can watch as he appears instantly within the doorways, and something strange takes place here that's hard to catch even in bullet time. When he's moved into this doorway, his tail glitches around like crazy in the hallway, but this only lasts for a few frames in super slow motion, so it'd be near impossible to notice during gameplay. After snatching our gas mask, Doey does what he knows best, and scurries off up the ramp and out of sight, unloading around the corner. Now after this, you head out into an open area overlooking a construction site down below. On the walls, we can see what looks like tons of houses and buildings hanging from the rock formations. There's nothing inside of them, but despite this, they're modeled and textured on the inside. There's not much to them besides this, and we'll be taking a closer look at this construction area a bit later on. As soon as we step outside, there are a couple of doors on our right that we can access. The first is this metal one, and peeking inside reveals that this is really an elevator. Following it up top, we'll find that it probably leads to another sliding door on the next floor. And it's a good thing it's blocked off too, considering there is no actual elevator inside and it's merely an empty shaft. The second door leads to another room containing an assortment of barrels, pallets, and an abandoned forklift. Unfortunately, we're not forklift certified, which is probably why we can't access this room. The sliding door here doesn't lead anywhere either, so this room only exists to look cool, and also make us wish that we had the sweet forklift certification. Someday. After swinging across the gap, you'll traverse a hallway with an electric swimming pool. And this was a trap set by the Doctor in order to disable your second hand. We cannot smart him though, we have the technology. By dragging one of these big blocks over here, we can maneuver it close to the water's edge. And by jumping on top and dragging it along, the player can get past these metal bars up top. From here you can just leap across and into the following section. Your right hand fully functional. The game doesn't check here to make sure the player's hand is disabled when entering this part of the level. So we can get past this point completely unaffected. But the devs managed to cover their bases despite that fact. The purple jump pad here is currently turned off, so even though we've cheated the system and kept our hand, we cannot leap across the gap regardless. So despite breaking the order of events, we'll still have to eat a refreshing bolt of lightning as we swing across. We can now play through this maze section with both hands equipped and active, but to be honest, this doesn't give us much advantage, if any at all. The only real difference here is that we could carry 2 batteries at once, but that's about it. Even though she's a nightmare critter, the flare hand doesn't scare her off like it would with the smaller ones. Actually, the little nightmare critters in the cages don't react to it either. So having a second hand provides basically zero benefit, but it's still a really neat way to break the game. Taking a look at the map itself, there's really not much going on out of bounds since this fight sequence is pretty straightforward. We can, however, take a look at the introduction sequence from another perspective. When Baba Chops first shows up, we can see her appear in this room as the door opens up. Beneath the level, we'll find a copy of this enemy T-posing below her spawn location. When the player turns to look this way, our sheep friend here warps into the map, turning to look at you as she runs out of sight. The version of this character with AI then spawns in the same spot, and the others move back to their T-posing location out of bounds, with Baba now running through the maze after us. We can watch what happens after she attacks the player and warps through the map. Once she's successfully attacked you, she'll run between a set of cages and Super Mario her way into the pipes overhead. I'm not actually sure where she goes at this time, since I wasn't able to locate her after she vanished. But when she does reappear, it'll be inside of another pipe elsewhere in the map. She'll blink back into the map via one of the pipes, but she's a bit crunched up as this takes place. She unfolds into her regular pose as she hits the ground and begins her endless pursuits once more. Now I'm not exactly sure what caused this to happen, but during my game breaking here, somehow the game, broke? Imagine that. Baba basically just stopped moving after attacking me, and so for the rest of the puzzle, she just sort of stood in place here. Even when I walked through her, nothing was triggered, and I didn't even take damage for doing so. It's a lot safer walking around this maze with no evil sheep in tow, but it's far too easy like this, so I reloaded my save and got her moving again. Before finishing this puzzle, I messed with our woolly adversary in a pretty interesting way. By using hacks, I was able to force the game into using a different model for Baba Chops, so now our enemy is actually Icky Licky. It turns out that the nightmare critters all share a mesh file, while, and so regardless of which model is used, they will still function as intended. That means they can run around as usual, jumping and attacking with fully intact animations. This works for all the nightmare critter models currently in the game as well, so I could even change her into a Simon Smoke if I wanted to. As we finish this puzzle, we'll be locked in a room with Simon Smoke, and the doctor makes us decide whether we want to spare him or save ourselves. If we take a look beneath the map here, we'll find a copy of Simon's model asserting dominance while floating in the void. But this is only one of many T-posing characters this sequence contains. After the door closes behind you, a handful of nightmare critters will spawn behind the door in a T-pose, warping into their jumping sequences as they hit the windows. Believe it or not, you don't even need hacks to see this, since loading your save in this location has a chance of just despawning the door behind you. So you can walk outside and watch this taking place during regular gameplay. At the end of this sequence, you'll plug this cord into this container, shocking Simon Smoke inside as lightning arcs from the machine. In this case, he fell backwards, and half of his model clipped through the glass on top, bringing us to the end of this particular puzzle. Something the developers originally overlooked was the player's ability to just do this all over again. So if you completed this area after the Simon Smoke room, and you were ready to move on, you could just shoot your hand out over the maze again. This would cause you to get shocked and fall down as the Baba Chops event restarted, as the doctor proceeds as if this didn't happen yet. Except this time the elevator had already ascended, so even if the boss fight were completed, our means of escape have left us behind. Jumping back into our recap, with our poor dragon pal fried, we'll take the lift up to the balcony and open the door. This game loves elevators, so we'll take yet another lift upwards, this time leading us to a hallway full of the doctor-infected computers. When the door opens, we'll pass through, getting blindsided by one of its vessels and thrown into the basement. You'll now have to search this dark maze for batteries, but some of the vessels are still alive and can activate if you cross through their line of sight. Some of these encounters are scripted, like this one that drops from the ceiling after a battery is taken from its terminal. With each battery collected, this cable will light up and guide you upstairs, where you can use this terminal to shut down the doctor's life support, killing him in the process. We can now leave this room, grabbing the Omni Hand as we do, allowing the player to access the lift and continue onwards. So reversing time, we'll head back upstairs and open the door to access the lift. While we're up here, there are two of these massive doors, but we can't ever get through the one on the right. If we somehow opened it, we'd find that we're actually on the moon, or at least a rock formation that looks like it. There's something super creepy about these inaccessible areas, especially ones overlooking the massive rock formations in the distance. That being said, we can now take the elevator up, where we'll reach this hallway full of televisions. Besides these, there are these two doorways here on either side of the hallway that we can't access at the moment. But as you can see from an outside view, only one of them leads somewhere. This area here is where we exchange our red hand for the Omni Hand. But the door is locked at this point, and we don't have the key card necessary to use the machine anyway. It takes more than a flimsy door to stop me though, and so I figured out how to remove it from our path and was able to access the Omni Hand room before even opening the main set of doors in the hallway. Because we're playing this part of the game backwards at the moment, the doors to the doctor's resting place will open and close as the objective updates. Unfortunately, this locks you out of getting the key card needed to upgrade your hand, so I had to break the door down yet again. At this point in time, there aren't any of the doctor's vessels guarding his containment area, so we can walk straight up to the terminal and eject the required key card completely unbothered. Because of this, I was able to kill the doctor, and even though I could hear his minions attacking, there weren't any of them in the room. From here, I could get the Omni Hand using the key card and head out, and since the door is broken, I didn't even have to waste a charge opening it. Jumping in the lift took me down as expected, meaning we completely skipped this boss fight altogether. We're going to trigger the boss fight as intended now, but really quick before we do, I was running around while shrunken down, yeeting myself off the side of the map, which caused the maze up above to partially unload. After a brief stutter, every single one of the doctor's robots fell into the void, which kinda caught me off guard at first. Back inside the map, approaching the doors in this hallway trigger a cutscene where you're jump scared by one of the doctor's robo-boys. If we move the camera inside, we'll see that this enemy isn't currently present, but when the player heads to the doorway, they'll suddenly appear behind the door. They'll lift you up and then toss you away in the most disrespectful manner possible. And when the floor opens up, they'll wave at you to salt the wound just a little bit more. Now in the basement, we can see things a lot better with the place lit up. One of the first things I wanted to check out was the robotic nightmares chasing us through the darkness. To my understanding, there are multiple versions of the same enemy that you'll encounter here. Some of them are simply inanimate objects placed here to look creepy and cannot activate regardless of what takes place. But the others are active models programmed to awaken and chase the player when they run by. There are also some that will move as you trigger them, not to chase the player, but instead to give you a little jump as you're exploring the area. I thought they'd only respond to the player's presence when standing in front of them, but this bot here twitches when the player runs behind them instead. I saw the top of the head moving when I ran by, and while they won't awaken when running in front of them, their screen lights up and their body twitches for just a moment. For the most part, these vessels will always return to their starting location after the player evades them. Although, there is an exception to this rule, which I'll explain in just a minute. During our time here, there's also a scripted encounter with a vessel that drops down from the ceiling and flies towards the player, killing you instantly if it manages to catch you. If we move the camera up to the top of these hallways, you'll see that beyond this black barrier is a small opening in the ceiling, but nowhere near enough space for a full-size robot. There are, however, a couple sets of hoses and plugs hanging down directly above these holes, one on each side of this hallway. As we pull the battery out and start walking away, the vessel will spawn in the direction we tried to exit from, using instant transmission to warp above the hallway. They then drop down through the dip in the ceiling, the hoses connecting to their back and holding them off the ground. After a bit, the bot begins pursuing you, and if you're caught, the jump scare animation will play out. The player, who looks super tiny by the way, will be lifted up and moved in front of their screen just before they unload. I'm not sure why, but this enemy respawned a moment later, dropping down in front of the player and restarting their chasing animation. If we manage to evade them though, they'll just slip through the ceiling and stop next to the other set of hoses, looking extremely disappointed in themselves. When it comes to things taking place off camera, there really isn't a whole lot to see in this basement area. That being said though, it's time to start breaking the doctor's vessels. First, I adjusted the speed in which these enemies can run, making them run super slow. One thing I realized is that despite being slowed way down, these robots will still activate at a regular pace. The only difference is that they're now incapable of chasing me down. I mean, they can, but there's no way they can catch up to me. A scary game with snail-paced monsters isn't all that scary though, so instead I made the terrible decision to speed them up. This was an awful idea, and no matter how fast I run, they'll always be right behind me. The terrifying feeling of being chased basically never stopped, and these bots never gave me a moment to catch my breath. The only reason I didn't get bonked to death instantly is because these enemies can't hurt you unless their attacking animation takes place while the player is close enough. Their attacks were of course faster too, but it still gave me enough time to escape if I moved quick enough. This change even impacted the vessel that drops down from the ceiling, and if I didn't already know it was coming, I doubt I'd be able to escape them in time. I'm sure you realize by now that this maze is pretty claustrophobic, so I opened up some space by making myself the tiniest little guy you've ever seen. This wasn't the easy remedy I was hoping it would be, since my robotic enemies were now the size of a building in comparison to me. Even though I was so tiny, I was a lot stronger than I looked. Somehow, I was able to walk into the vessel's feet and bump them around the floor, which I instantly regretted because this set them off. You'd think being so tiny would open up more places to hide, but sadly, not all these objects have mesh-accurate colliders, so I couldn't slip underneath these shelves the way I'd hoped. I was able to head through the board-up crawl space while sprinting though, which made it a bit easier to navigate this part of the level safely. One issue you'll run into at this size is carrying these batteries. Because we're so close to the floor, the placement of our hands isn't accurate to the models used for the grab pack. The only way to get past this is by looking nearly straight up while inserting each battery, which is ironically a small price to pay for the benefits of being tiny. Speaking of benefits, we don't even need to leave the hallway when the vessel drops down from the ceiling. My small stature let me squeeze through the fence and outside the bot's hitbox, so they pass right by without a care in the world. That being said, let's mess with the sides of our adversary now instead. First, I tried shrinking them down, and to be honest, they'd be sorta cute if they weren't trying to bash my face in at the moment. The game didn't really appreciate this modification though, and by activating the bot, we'll see that their AI is now a bit broken, and not just the tiny one. This area with the batteries is typically inaccessible by the vessels, but the parameters have somehow changed, and they were able to walk inside like they own the place. We can still open and close the doors, but at this point, the pathing is broken beyond repair. On the other hand, we can expand the dock's minions instead, and this actually makes them easier to avoid. Because they're so huge, they can't always get through these tight hallways without getting stuck. As you can clearly see, this poor guy is in a perpetual loop of his running animations, and his AI has no idea how to get free. With the maze now behind us, we can watch in slow motion as the doctor's final remaining piece is destroyed. As this meltdown occurs, a giant wave of electricity expands from his brain container, and inside, we can see that this once floating object is now respecting the laws of physics. As we're leaving this area, our red hand will be upgraded into the Omni hand. The hand we deposited will unload after it has left our sight, and on the other side, the Omni hand will suddenly appear. The pedestal that holds the hand will quickly rise up through the machine and into view, meaning we can now equip the new hand and head back down the lift we entered from. And with that, that's everything I broke and found hidden behind the scenes in the Doctor's boss fight. As we approach the ending of Chapter 4, there's still quite a few things we must do. Plant some explosives, and in turn, deal with an explosive encounter with an old friend. So we had just gotten done with the doctor business and are now heading down to the skylift. This will take us on a trip, where we then make our way back into Safe Haven. Getting into the hub of Safe Haven, Poppy will address us, as she's thrilled to see that we got the Omni Hand. Confident that things are going smoothly, she'll go into the generator room. This initiates dialogue between the two, as we can see Doey doesn't seem too sure with how things are playing out. They are interrupted by a phone call by Ollie. In a panic, Ollie insists that the prototype is outside Safe Haven. This follows with Poppy telling Doey to go out and distract it, as the player is now tasked with fixing the generator. Ollie ends up assisting us as we do all this. Once that's all said and done, Poppy will tell us to head to the Foundation. We'll retrace steps through familiar areas as we go through the sewers again. We'll eventually reach this vat of acid again, but this time around, we'll need to solve this gear puzzle. Once we find all the gears and solve the puzzle, we'll head through this minecart area. But this time, we'll see that this once boarded up path is open now. Going deeper into these caves, we'll see that these tunnels are infested with these nightmare critters. We'll need to plant explosives throughout this area, so we collect explosives and plant them as so. Coming over here, you want to grab this purple card, as we'll need it, along with a recording of Doey's parents coming to see him. Sad face. We'll then want to start the gas, followed by having to direct the flow of gas so that it goes through these labeled portions, being A, B, and C. After doing this, we'll then need to initiate the gas overflow procedure, along with fixing the door that is jammed. We'll get chased by these little demons, which leads to this elevator that ends up saving us. Let's go back now though and take a closer look at everything we just endured. So something I noticed right from the start here is the funny business that takes place at this particular save point, once we open this door. If the player decides to reload this save, they'll come to the realization that it puts them into a completely different location. It's the part where we, the player, have to navigate this red gas-filled maze as we solve the puzzle. There is no mask though, and we're completely locked in this section now. The only solution for this is to reload the save prior to this particular one, and then never use it again, as we'll always put you in this room. However, you can see from where the save takes place, after opening this door with a blue hand, that's not terribly far from when the game ends up spawning us. To make matters worse, on the game's launch, if you walk by the skylift, you could actually come back to this maze and get locked inside again, which would force you to reload, thus causing the save issue just described. I did this on my first playthrough, and thought I was losing my mind. Anyways, if we follow the skylift's line with the camera, we can see portions of the map that are not loaded in, along with areas we've traversed through before, as most of these areas' graphics are toned down. Coming to the end of the skyline, where it stops loading in, we can see something way off in the distance though. Getting a closer look once again reveals that it's our little lemon friend, just hanging out here, all by his lonesome self. Carrying on though, I try to see in multiple instances if I could get myself down into the large area below, where we end up fighting Doey. This results with a hard no, with all these areas that we just looked at having no collision, hence falling through them and into the great beyond. Deciding to carry on to the next section though, I noticed as I was riding the skylift that a portion of the world was never loaded in, resulting with the player being able to see out of bounds portions of the factory down below. I initially was going to chalk it up to the fact that I've been messing with the game, but couldn't help myself and decided to exit out the game and load it back up, to see if that was the case. I ended up taking the skylift for another ride, and turns out that this portion of the map simply doesn't load in for me, even without mods. During my initial playthrough, I did not notice this at all surprisingly. As you can see, I just simply wasn't paying attention. I'll just blame it on the lighting going bonkers during this part, I suppose. But yeah, these portions never loaded in. Anyways, we can see that once we get off the skylift, Safe Haven will be loaded in at this point. Coming in for a closer look, we can find Doey in a T-pose position. While I was checking out this chill dough ball, I noticed something below him though. After further investigation, you'll see that it is the one and only true hurt Kissy. Curiously, her model is much smaller, and I'm not entirely sure why that is. But yeah, she too is, well, half T-posed, with her injured arm in an arm sling. I don't know why she's a small gal though. Moving on, as I approach the vent that grants us access to the main hub of Safe Haven, I noticed some light punching through where the wall and ceiling meet. Taking a closer look, and to my surprise, the light we're seeing is actually the out-of-bounds visual of the main hub area. Oops. I suppose a little caulk could fix this? At this point though, as we're exiting the vent, we can see T-pose Doey will zip over to the generator room, where we end up having our one and only interaction with him during this scene. Something I noticed while checking this area out was this object that was spawned in right outside the generator room, as it plummets into the void. I believe it's an external resistor, which is one of the pieces we need to use while repairing the generator. However, once Doey and Poppy finish talking, Doey heads off to distract the prototype. Following him, he'll sprint through the main hub as he approaches the showers, only to zip through the wall and disappear. Checking this out again, but in slow motion, we'll see that he clips through the wall as he continuously shrinks. He shrinks out of existence and is nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, Poppy's got her sights locked onto the camera, overall giving a creepy vibe, as she gives me a slight jump scare. I fixed the generator though and carried on as I headed towards the sewers. You'll notice in this view we have that we can actually see where the loading occurs as we traverse through this hole that leads to the sewers, being something I missed during my first time coming through here. All of this is not entirely new, as we've come through here before, so I ended up doing the gear puzzle, as we're normally supposed to, and then made my way over to the area where all the explosives are. Heading this way will load in the entirety of this area, as you can see. This is the whole bomb finding and planting section. There's not much to see out of bounds, but here it is. As soon as we turn this corner though, we'll see this little fella flee as we proceed. Curious as to where they go, I took a closer look, finding that they don't get far and vanish once outside the player's view. Traversing through these tunnels, more of these little guys will pursue us as they try to end our life. I noticed that if we leave the tunnel area that they will simply retreat, and if we follow them with a camera, you'll see that they take a trip all the way back to where Baba Chops disappeared just a few moments ago. It's funny looking because they don't despawn, resulting with this particular mini Huggy getting his daily exercise in. However, when we shoot one of these miniature demons, we can see that they will straight up disappear once making it to one of these holes. It's odd how they react differently in each case. Just about as odd as the tails on the Tuies, as they appear strangely elongated. I was going to try to explore out of reach areas with the player, but as you can see, a lot of these paths literally lead to nothing, so I carried on. Now that we're further into this area, we can see it's the only section loaded in now. With that, I initiated the next objective, as we now need to redirect the gas into the storage tank. Looking closely at the gas as it fills these pipes is visually confusing, as they fill them from right to left when the flow is supposed to be going left to right. We can also see, unsurprisingly, that the pipes are hollow, with no gas inside when we take a closer look. However, once we solve this puzzle, we'll need to fix the door. But something happens that I wasn't aware of during my first playthrough. We can see these little fellas jump on the glass as they end up crawling out of our view and disappear. If we decide to just sit here and wait though, we'll see more nightmare critters as they approach the stairs. But then, an army of critters will start spawning in. There are a ton of them, eventually getting to the point where the whole floor is filled. They'll just run in a straight line, as they don't truly pursue us. It was confusing though, because the ones that were actually pursuing us could be seen retreating. It may have been because I died though, not entirely sure. Needless to say, it was quite the scene, as these monsters filled the room. Fixing the door though, I realized I was able to sit up in this particular area as the critters couldn't reach me. During this, you can see a bunch of them in the previous area frustratingly trying to figure out how to get to me. We can see this one in particular has mad hops, which was pretty cool, but overall is pointless, seeing as they simply cannot reach me. Sorry, not sorry. We'll encounter a few more as we head for the elevator, which will have a few critters spawn in on the door as we escape. But that's about it. So let's carry on now as we normally would throughout this game. We now have to make our way up this elevator, which leads us out and back to this big open area from where we came, as Doey then grabs us from behind. Apparently Doey has lost track of the prototype and he's having trouble understanding what's going on. This is when all of a sudden we can see in the background an explosion occurs within Safe Haven. Doey, being in disbelief, simply says, "Oh no," as he turns a mush into the pipe behind us. So we'll make our way to Safe Haven again. We can hear Doey scream in terror as we make our way through the sewers, along with encountering some nightmare critters. It's when we enter Safe Haven though that we'll see it's in shambles, as there appears to be no survivors. We'll see Doey in the main hub area as the cutscene takes place once we enter the room. Doey's having a mental breakdown while he expresses his sympathy towards all the victims, as he begins to snap on and off into rage, ultimately blaming everyone for the misery him and his friends have endured. As he struggles to cope, he sets his sights on us for revenge, making it clear that he wants us dead now. Accidentally collapsing the structure onto himself, he'll re-emerge as this monstrous creature, as he moans and screams in pain. He'll begin to chase us, as we'll need to reach this elevator for temporary safety. I'm gonna tell you right now, my first time playing through this, I was in a panic. So I was honed in while running, looking for an escape. So instead of grabbing the handle, I just jumped down this hill thinking I was supposed to do this. But there's no collision here, so you just fall out of the map, drifting forever in the void. And though we wish for death, we are unable to die. So, we reload? Let's turn back time first though. Once coming up the elevator, we'll see that the bomb planting section unloads. We can then take a closer look at this interaction we have with Doey. He simply appears behind us, sliding for a brief moment as this interaction begins. Wrapped in his arms, or rather, sucked into his body, it gives the appearance that Doey's talking to himself, which does track, seeing as he's about to lose his mind in the next scene. But I digress. We can see that the explosion that occurs off in the distance will spit some rocks out, but when Doey retreats in disbelief, he'll eventually disappear. Slowing this down though, we'll see that his goof form will begin forming right before he vanishes, as this all obviously occurs much faster in real time. Heading back doesn't have too much going on, but I was getting some weird visuals of this hole that takes us back to Safe Haven. We've talked about it before, but I'm pretty sure we're not supposed to be seeing that. Safe Haven is in shambles, and we can find Doey in the main hub waiting for his cutscene to begin. Now during my first playthrough, I noticed that there was a figure that was lingering down the hall. I didn't know what to make of it, but going back later, I came to realize it was Doey's killer monster form just chilling here in front of the elevator. No idea why it's just in plain sight, but here it is. It makes sense to preload the model, but putting it somewhere else might be more ideal. We can watch Doey collapse the debris onto himself, as this is the last time we normally see him in his friendly form. His model will drop further into the darkness, but letting it up, we'll see his monster form down below. Watching this beast come up in slow motion is terrifying, as it rises up with his deformed face rising as well. Clipping through the floor, he'll rise out of the debris, as we'd normally be seeing him at this point. I must say, I do love the model they end up having for his monster form. It's terrifyingly great, and reminds me of that one rocket jump video where all the Liquid Slam kids merged together. Glorious! So as I began running from this beast, I decided to go through the fence instead of getting on the elevator. We can watch him pull the elevator down from here, but once he fails, he then ends up residing where we had seen him before. Coming back out, I can jump around the back side of him and shoot some flares. We can now go back to the main hub, but with very limited ground to cover. So I took the time to give a moment of silence to our dear friend Doey, as he's no longer the doe who was once our bro. However, I noticed once we get up and out of the elevator, if we come back down with the camera, we can see he's curiously back in the hub area. Now, this is where I accidentally jumped to my death, but in my first playthrough, my game kinda broke here. So for one, respawning for this initial chase threw me into an infinite death loop where I couldn't run after I spawned. So Doey would just kill me over and over. It was like there was an invisible wall in the hallway. Actually, somehow I'm pretty sure there was. And so rewinding to watch the cutscene again, hoping to fix this bug, this time when I went to go on the elevator, the gate was already shut. So I died, and was once again thrown into an infinite death loop. It took me like 45 minutes of messing with the game with mods to get past this, and it was incredibly frustrating. So without cheating, I would have been stuck here until they pushed some kind of fix. But let's move on past this to upstairs again. So instead of jumping off like before, we'll want to grab this handle, make our way down, and continue running. We'll come across a couple obstacles that we need to get through, all while Doey chases us. This will lead us into a hole where Doey grabs a hold of us, but luckily is deterred as a large rock falls onto them. We'll then slide down this mine shaft as we go deeper into this nightmare. It's here though that Doey will catch up with us as a boss fight begins within this large dugout area. At this point we're tasked with having to freeze and cut Doey in order to defeat this mutated pack of kids. There are liquid nitrogen canisters in various spots within this whole area, but you don't want to do what I just did here. Rather, you'll want to get Doey to run over the canister as they will start carrying it. Then you'll time it and shoot it as Doey runs under a saw, allowing you to bring down the saw blade, which will chip away at our poor ex-best friend. We'll do this multiple times, as Doey has various attacks while we progress through this. Eventually we'll defeat this blob, and we will then head out of this area. Finding the exit, we'll need to open this particular door within, but we will be met with an intense jump scare, as Doey is not finished with us. Expressing how much the Pillsbury reject wants us dead, we'll want to shoot the loose canister on the left here, as this all takes place, which will cause an explosion that begins to heavily freeze the monster. Fighting through the pain, we attempt to end this poor creature's misery. I personally couldn't help but feel bad for Doey. As stated, Doey tried to be better, but ultimately was bested by the prototype, leading to this horrific demise. So that sucks. Anyways, let's take a closer look at what we just went through. So we had just given a farewell to Doey, but coming over here, we can see that the boss fight area is now loaded in, with a giant death barrier down below. As I was zipping down here into this next part though, I saw Killer Doey slide in from my left side, prompting me to figure out where they came from. At first I thought it was the same model that was sitting in front of the elevator, but as you can see, that's not the case. After a little more investigating, I was able to determine that this was a duplicate that ends up just appearing, so they'll slide into position to chase us. We can, however, avoid this chase, as they'll end up ignoring us. Doey will proceed to chase as if we are seen, but Doey will stick to a set path. They'll stop at this debris that we can eventually crawl through, and getting a bit too close ends up being my fatal mistake. I did try to take a shortcut here, but as you can see, it didn't work out so great. Carrying on, I slid down to the next area. So when we enter through this doorway, we'll see that Doey will appear to our left and up above. I checked all around to see if there are duplicate Doeys used for this part, but I didn't see any. However, I did see a bright dot in the distance, so I went in for a closer look. It turned out to be one of those canisters we'll be using to freeze Doey, just floating out here in the great beyond. As Trio Mutant Doey made their entrance, I managed to slide back through the door to safety. I wanted to see how they react, but they ended up being nowhere in sight. This is probably because we're not in there. However, moving closer to the door does cause Doey to appear for a brief moment, although it doesn't last long. Doey ended up climbing the crane that's in the center of the map, attempting to do the spit attack. It's clearly not working though, and it's probably because of where we're at. When Doey finished the attack on top of the crane, they tried to go underground, as they disappeared in the center of the room. What I came to realize though, is that by going to small boy mode here, you'll see that Doey is unable to grab us, making the player nearly invulnerable to attacks, or at least this one in particular. Hands off, you creep! It's once again visually strange looking watching Doey perform this attack. It is pretty cool to see the saw go to work in slow motion though, just ripping and tearing away as Doey enters Pain Town. We can see as Doey performs this particular attack how the hands will load in and slide up. I was so into watching this play out that I forgot that the hands may actually be damaging me right now, which ended up being the case, as I died while coming back to control my player. With the spit attack though, you can see how it's giant clusters of these multi-color spikes that come flying down. This does make one wonder just how much dough this beast can shoot, or rather generate, because they spit a ton of these at us. I think my size threw the monster off here though, seeing as there was some, aiming difficulties, as you can clearly see. Doey's determination to destroy me never deters though. So I give Doey the last saw blade treatment as we watch them melt into this puddle of goop. I win. Going out of bounds, we can see only so much that is loaded in at this point. I did find this battery socket though, which is located right below the final scene with Doey. A text under it reads, "Used for limiting use of hand scanners above." As soon as we use these hand scanners, Doey will be right behind us. There's not much else hidden during this sequence, but checking this whole interaction out in slow motion is pretty intense, as we savor every second of Doey's misery. It's truly a heartbreaking scene though, because Doey's potential for being good did show throughout this chapter. In the end though, it became too much weight to bear. Just like this drill is coming down. After this takes place, we can slide back out into the big area again if we wanted. However, not much is out here, aside from another model of Doey that's frozen. It is harmless, as we're able to walk right through it. Something else that took place was when I loaded this particular checkpoint up and came back to the deceased Doey, where I was able to start up the cutscene again with the hand scanners. It basically plays out just as it normally would, minus the drill being down already. I thought I soft locked myself at this point, seeing that I couldn't pull the drill down again. However, Doey ended up randomly taking damage from the drill, ultimately letting the scene play out and finish. This did result with me being stuck in the ground though. Let's give Doey a break, so they can rest in peace now, as we continue on. So after this traumatizing scene with Doey, we're now tasked with searching for survivors. This leads us to another tape that we can play, but follows with us sliding down this vent, where we can find Poppy and Kissy. Poppy is unpleased, as she begins to point the finger at us for everything that has happened. However, the big reveal takes place here as we discover that Ollie is in fact the prototype, who has been playing Poppy all along. A lot of dialogue occurs here, but ultimately ends with Poppy expressing how she can't go back, which follows with her leaving Kissy and the player. The prototype then blows up the floor beneath us, as we have this tragic scene with Kissy, who ends up losing her arm as she tries to hang on to us. Our new objective will present us with question marks, as we'll just want to push on at this point. Traversing through this cave we've fallen into will lead us to this area where there's a bunch of quite particular vegetation that's being grown here. I'm feeling some Resident Evil 5 vibes. Eventually we'll end up in this room where there's yet another tape. The head of innovation at Playtime Co, Leith Pierre, will begin talking. The dialogue gets dark real quick, seeing as playing this tape basically set off an alarm, as we're informed on the tape. This follows with us seeing a shadowy figure back from where we came, as we end up discovering that it's Huggy. Gas will start to fill the room as Chapter 4 concludes, with the credits rolling shortly after. It's time to go back though, and take a final, closer look at everything we just experienced. Now that Doey's gone, we have to search for survivors, with Poppy and Kissy being the only 2 remaining. We can find them down here waiting for us to slide down. There's not much going on in this area, so I went ahead and started this cutscene with Poppy and Kissy. It's an overall depressing vibe, as the sense of defeat creeps up on all the characters. There of course is no prototype lurking out of bounds during this, but we can watch Poppy abandon us as this plays out. It's an especially sad moment for Kissy, as you can see, but Poppy will make her way through this pipe and eventually disappear around the bend. We can watch as the floor gets blown up from under our feet too, as Kissy hangs on for her dear life. Eventually, Kissy's arm is going to give and fall off, but when it does, I noticed a thin piece of geometry that was attached to it, making for a peculiar sight. However, in slow motion, we'll see that Kissy and the arm are both flung back up above during this part. Kissy can then be sadly found, jammed in this fan inside the ventilation shaft, with her arm floating within the room we were just in. The phone can be found under the map, where we can just see it floating in the great beyond. Once we've fallen, the Kissy arm will quickly come back down for the scene, where we normally see it fall next to us. I'm not gonna lie though, I'm not sure what happened here, but I ended up getting my one hand stuck out of bounds, which led to this confusing direction it took. The hand was running back and forth along the arm, ultimately being a situation I couldn't make sense of. Just look at this work of art. Glorious! We're now approaching the end, as we walk through this final area. Nothing is really going on out of bounds here, but we can absolutely get a closer look at Huggy Wuggy during this final scene. He's definitely got some mileage on him with all the wounds he sustained, but you can see in his face his spirits are still high. His terrifying run towards the door is great to watch in slow motion in all its horror. It's an intense reveal for our old foe. With the no pain, no gain mentality, he viciously shows that he's ready for a second shot at devouring us. Or perhaps helping us this time? Who knows? Once the credits roll though, we'll see that he is then placed into the room we are in, as he assumes the T-pose position. Looks like Huggy's gonna be back for Chapter 5, that's for sure. With that though, we've concluded our out-of-bounds journey through the entirety of Poppy Playtime Chapter 4. I hope you enjoyed this behind-the-scenes look, glitches and all. And of course, I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!